"Megan, you'll be helping in the kitchen during the ceremony? We need all hands on deck back there," my mother said, not even looking up from her seating chart, as if assigning her only daughter to kitchen duty at her son's wedding was the most natural thing in the world. I stood there in my $3,000 dress, the one I'd bought specifically for walking down that aisle as a bridesmaid, feeling my heart crack just a little more. And that's when I knew, after 32 years of being the invisible child, this was going to be my last family event. My name is Megan. I'm a software engineer who built her own tech company from scratch, and somehow I'd spent 3 decades believing that if I just tried harder, achieved more, gave more, my family would finally see me as more than their personal ATM and unpaid help. Growing up, I was always the one in the background of family photos, if I was included at all, while my younger brother Daniel starred in every frame, every conversation, every proud parental moment. And I told myself it was fine because at least I had a family, even if they seemed to forget I existed unless bills needed paying. My company, which I'd never fully explained to them because they never asked, had just landed a massive contract that would net us $2.3 million annually, and ironically, the client was my brother's employer, though he had no idea his weird computer sister was about to become his company's most important vendor. 4 days before the wedding, I'd already paid $15,000 for flowers, $8,000 for catering upgrades, and covered the entire rehearsal dinner because Daniel's just starting out in his career, even though he'd been just starting out for 8 years while I quietly funded his lifestyle. Standing in my childhood home, watching my mother plan the perfect wedding for her perfect son, I realized I'd been funding my own exclusion for years, and this time, when she casually mentioned I should probably wear something more practical for all that kitchen work, I simply smiled and said nothing, because sometimes the best revenge starts with silence. The kitchen assignment shouldn't have surprised me, considering my entire childhood was a masterclass in being overlooked, starting with my 7th birthday when my parents forgot to pick me up from school because Daniel had a soccer game, leaving me sitting on the curb until a teacher drove me home at 6 p.m., and they didn't even apologize, just said I should have reminded them it was my birthday. Every family vacation photo told the same story. Daniel centered and beaming, my parents flanking him with proud smiles, and me, when I was there at all, slightly out of frame, like someone had remembered at the last second to include me, though usually they hadn't bothered, claiming the camera ran out of film whenever I asked why I wasn't in the pictures. "Megan's our practical one," my father would say at family gatherings, which translated to, "Megan pays for things, fixes problems, and doesn't need attention," while Daniel was our creative spirit, which meant he could quit 6 jobs in 3 years while I covered his rent, utilities, and even his weekly grocery deliveries because he was finding himself. The pattern crystallized during college when I worked 3 jobs to pay my tuition, while my parents drained their savings for Daniel's art school dreams, and when I graduated summa cum laude with a computer science degree, they missed my ceremony because Daniel had an emergency. He'd run out of gas money again and needed someone to Western Union him $200 immediately. My mother perfected the art of selective memory, forgetting my promotion celebrations, but remembering every time Daniel sneezed, calling me only when bills arrived but never when good news did, treating my success like an ATM she'd discovered, rather than achievements worth celebrating. And whenever I tried to share my victories, she'd interrupt with, "That's nice, dear, but did you hear about Daniel's new project?" The worst part was how they'd weaponized guilt. Family helps family when Daniel needed another loan. Don't be selfish. When I suggested they contribute something, "You're so lucky to have that good job." As if my 80-hour weeks building a company were just fortunate accidents rather than blood, sweat, and years of being invisible while they poured every resource into their golden child. When I started my tech company at 25, sleeping on office floors and living on ramen, they never asked how I was doing, but when it succeeded, suddenly I had family members I'd forgotten existed, all with Daniel-related expenses that somehow became my responsibility because you're the one with money now. That kitchen assignment was just the latest in 3 decades of reminders that in the family hierarchy, I ranked somewhere below the caterers we'd hired. At least they were considered essential enough to be seen and thanked for their service. "Actually, Mom, I need to talk to you about the contract," I said 3 days before the wedding, holding the folder containing the $2.3 million annual agreement between my company and Daniel's employer. But she waved me off without looking up, saying, "Not now, Megan. We're discussing whether Daniel wants lilies or roses for the altar arrangements." I stood there for a full minute, contract in hand, watching her fuss over flower choices with more attention than she'd ever given to any aspect of my life. And that's when Daniel walked in, saw me, and actually said, "Oh, good, you're here. Can you transfer me another $2,000? The bachelor party went over budget, as if I were his personal banking app rather than his sister. I just need 5 minutes. I started, but my mother cut me off with, "Megan, please, this is Daniel's special week. Can't your little work thing wait?" And I realized she genuinely had no idea that my little work thing was about to become the primary revenue source for the company, where her precious son worked as a mid-level account manager. The breaking point came when Daniel added, "Yeah, and make sure you're here early Saturday to help set up the kitchen. The caterers need someone who knows what they're doing back there." And then he actually snapped his fingers at me like I was hired help, while our mother nodded approvingly, as if this were perfectly reasonable. I watched them return to their flower debate, my own brother treating me like staff at his wedding, my mother enabling it as always, and something inside me that had bent for 32 years finally snapped clean in half. Not with anger, but with a clarity so sharp it took my breath away. "You know what? You're absolutely right," I said quietly, sliding the contract back into my briefcase. "My work thing can definitely wait," and neither of them noticed the shift in my tone, too absorbed in choosing between baby's breath and eucalyptus to recognize they'd just lost their last chance. That night, I sat in my home office, staring at the contract that would have secured Daniel's job for years, and made 3 phone calls, first to my lawyer, then to my CFO, and finally to the CEO of Daniel's company, who was thrilled to hear I was available for a meeting, just not the kind my family was expecting. The irony was perfect. While they planned a wedding where I'd be hidden in the kitchen like shameful secret, I was planning something too. The kind of corporate maneuvering that would teach them exactly what happens when you treat your meal ticket like she's worthless. Because some lessons can only be learned when the bills come due. When I finally went to bed that night, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years around my family. Peace. Because for the first time in my life, I wasn't trying to earn their love anymore. I was simply done. And that decision would cost them more than they could possibly imagine. The next morning, I met with Harrison, the CEO of my brother's company, at his private club downtown. And when I explained that I'd need to restructure our contract timeline due to unexpected family conflicts of interest, he was surprisingly understanding, especially after I offered a 10% discount for the inconvenience of the delay. "Take all the time you need, Megan," he said, then added casually, "You know, Daniel's mentioned you a few times. Apparently you're quite the cook?" And I had to bite my tongue to keep from laughing at how my brother had reduced my identity even at his workplace to kitchen duties, having no idea his cook sister was about to determine his professional future.
I spent the rest of that day liquidating certain positions, moving money between accounts, and setting up a new LLC that would handle all family-related financial matters going forward. With an ironclad operating agreement that my lawyer assured me was bulletproof against emotional manipulation, which felt like armor against 32 years of guilt trips. My mother called twice about kitchen logistics, and both times I answered sweetly, "Of course, Mom. Whatever you need," while simultaneously canceling the final catering payment and the flower balance, leaving just enough time that they wouldn't notice until the morning of the wedding, when fixing it would be someone else's emergency. The hardest part was maintaining the facade when my father called asking for a small loan of $15,000 for some investment opportunity Daniel had found. And instead of my usual immediate transfer, I said I'd need to check my liquidity after the wedding expenses, buying myself time while knowing that money would never materialize. I also discovered, through some careful research, that Daniel's company had been counting on our contract to meet their quarterly projections. Apparently, Harrison had already promised the board a major new client win, which explained why he'd been so eager to accommodate my timeline adjustment, not knowing he was one signature away from a very different kind of quarterly report. That Thursday, I cleaned out my childhood bedroom at my parents' house, taking only what mattered. A few photos where I'd accidentally been included, my grandmother's ring that she'd left specifically to me, though my mother had tried to give it to Daniel's fiancé, and every single financial document that proved the decade of support I'd provided. The most satisfying preparation was drafting the email I wouldn't send until Sunday morning. A detailed accounting of every dollar I'd given them over the years, totaling $847,000, not including interest, attached to a formal notice that the Bank of Megan was permanently closed for business, effective immediately. Friday morning arrived with my mother's frantic call about the caterers claiming there was an outstanding balance, and I played dumb beautifully. That's strange, Mom. I distinctly remember paying them while sitting at my desk, watching their payment portal show the cancellation I'd processed, knowing they'd have to scramble for another form of payment or risk losing the catering entirely. The flower shop called them next with the same issue, and I heard my father cursing in the background about incompetent vendors, never once considering that their personal ATM had simply stopped dispensing cash, while I forwarded their increasingly desperate voicemails to my attorney as documentation of their expectations. Daniel texted me 14 times that day, each message more aggressive than the last. Where's the $2K I asked for? Escalating to, stop being selfish on my weekend. And finally, you better not embarrass me tomorrow, which I screenshot carefully, adding them to my growing file labeled simply evidence, knowing these would pair perfectly with the email I'd be sending to his entire company on Monday. The beautiful part was that they still expected me to show up early Saturday to manage the kitchen, so confident in my perpetual compliance that my mother actually texted me a list of duties, including coordinate with head chef and manage dietary restrictions, as if I were her unpaid wedding planner rather than her daughter. I made one last strategic move that afternoon, calling Harrison's assistant to schedule a formal contract signing for Monday at 9 a.m., ensuring it would be the first thing on his calendar after the wedding weekend, when he'd be refreshed and ready to hear why partnering with someone who values loyalty might be better than maintaining ties with companies that employ people like Daniel. My CFO thought I was crazy when I explained the delay, but understood when I said, sometimes the best business decision is personal, and agreed to have our legal team prepare an alternative proposal that would not only exclude Daniel's company, but specifically recommend our competitors for the partnership, effectively blacklisting them from the entire industry network we'd built. That evening, while my family frantically tried to figure out their vendor payment issues, I sat in my favorite restaurant, enjoying a $300 dinner alone, toasting myself with champagne that cost more than the small loan my father had requested, feeling lighter with every sip as I watched the sun set on my last day as their financial solution. The missed calls piled up, 23 from my mother, 31 from Daniel, 18 from my father, but I let them all go to voicemail, each desperate message another confirmation that I'd made the right choice, their panic over money revealing exactly how little they'd valued the person who'd provided it all these years. As midnight approached, I sent one final text to the family group chat, looking forward to helping in the kitchen tomorrow, knowing they'd read my enthusiasm as compliance, because sometimes the best revenge is letting people think they've won right until the moment they realize they've lost everything, and tomorrow they'd learn exactly what they'd thrown away. Saturday morning arrived with the kind of chaos that money can't fix when it's withdrawn at exactly the wrong moment, and I showed up at the venue at 7 a.m. as requested, wearing my practical clothes instead of the bridesmaid dress that hung unworn in my closet, finding my parents in the middle of a full-blown panic because 2 major vendors were demanding immediate payment before they'd unload a single flower or appetizer. "Megan, thank God you're here." My mother grabbed my arm, mascara already smearing. "There's been some terrible mix-up with the payments, and we need you to handle it right now." But I simply shook my head and said, "I'm sorry, Mom, but I already paid what we agreed on, and I need to get to the kitchen like you asked." Watching her face cycle through confusion, anger, and then something close to fear, Daniel stormed over, in his half-buttoned tuxedo shirt, his face red with rage. "Stop playing games and fix this now." But I remained calm and replied, "I'm not playing games, Daniel. I'm doing exactly what you asked, helping in the kitchen, remember?" And his hands actually clenched into fists as he realized I wasn't going to save him this time. The next 3 hours were a masterpiece of controlled chaos. As vendors packed up and left, the wedding coordinator quit on the spot when she realized she wouldn't be paid, and family members scrambled to cover costs they'd never imagined having to pay, while I quietly helped the skeleton crew that remained set up what little Ferd had been prepaid, maintaining my helpful kitchen servant role with perfect dedication. My father cornered me near the walk-in freezer, his voice low and threatening. "I don't know what you think you're doing, but you're going to fix this right now, or you're no longer welcome in this family." And I looked him straight in the eyes and said, "I haven't been welcome in this family for 32 years, Dad. Today you're just finally seeing the bill for it." The ceremony itself was a disaster. Half the guests left when they realized there would be no proper reception. The photographer departed after an hour, and Daniel's bride spent most of it crying, but not the happy tears anyone had envisioned, while I continued quietly working in the kitchen, exactly where they'd assigned me. The moment that broke them came when Harrison, my brother's CEO, arrived for the ceremony and found me in the kitchen wearing an apron, and his face went through several expressions before he said, "Megan, what are you doing back here?" And I simply replied, "Exactly what my family asked me to do, Harrison," watching him process what kind of people would put their daughter to work as help at her own brother's wedding. The reception limped along with grocery store wine and whatever food the remaining staff could cobble together. And when Daniel tried to give his groom's speech, his voice cracking as he talked about family supporting family, I quietly slipped out the kitchen's back door, leaving behind my apron and 32 years of trying to earn love from people who only saw my worth in dollar signs. But the real execution of justice wasn't the ruined wedding. It was the email I sent as I drove away, not just to my family, but to Harrison and the entire board of directors at Daniel's company, detailing why I was withdrawing from negotiations, and including screenshots of every demanding text, every dismissive message, every moment they'd treated me as their personal ATM, ensuring that everyone would know exactly what kind of man Daniel really was. The contract, worth $2.3 million annually, vanished into the ether, taking with it Daniel's job security, his reputation, and any chance of advancement in an industry where everyone would soon know he was the man who killed a major deal because he couldn't treat his own sister with basic human dignity, and somewhere in that kitchen he'd banished me to, he was about to learn that respect isn't something you can demand, it's something you earn, and he'd just lost his last chance to earn mine. 3 months later, I sat in my new corner office overlooking the city, reading an email from Harrison thanking me for recommending his company's new software partner, a competitor who was thriving with the contract I'd redirected their way, while my assistant brought in my afternoon coffee, and I realized I hadn't thought about my family in weeks. The fallout had been swift and complete. Daniel lost his job within a month when the board discovered he'd been taking credit for deals he hadn't closed. My parents' calls evolved from angry to desperate to pleading before stopping entirely. And the last I'd heard through mutual acquaintances, they downsized to a cramped apartment after realizing their lifestyle had been built entirely on my contributions. I donated the money I would have spent on their problems to a scholarship fund for young women in tech, specifically those estranged from their families, because I'd learned that sometimes the best family is the one you build yourself, not the one that shares your DNA but never saw your worth. My grandmother's ring now sat in my jewelry box next to a printed email from my mother, the only one I'd kept, where she'd admitted that they'd always known what they were doing, but figured I was strong enough to handle it, which taught me that strength isn't measured by how much you can endure, but by knowing when to stop enduring. The most unexpected part of my rebirth was the peace that came with boundaries. My phone no longer rang with demands disguised as requests. My bank account grew instead of constantly depleting. And for the first time in my life, my success was celebrated by people who genuinely cared about me, not what I could provide. I'd built a new tradition for myself. Every year on Daniel's wedding anniversary, I take myself to dinner at the most expensive restaurant in town, toasting with champagne to the woman who finally learned that being family doesn't mean being a doormat, and that sometimes the greatest gift you can give yourself is the absence of people who only see your value in dollar signs, because real love shouldn't come with an invoice attached. And I was done paying for affection that was never genuine.